went to a church recently and I was rather embarrassed to meet a girl that I'd known 25 years ago in the foyer. Not for the reason you might be thinking, but just because when I was young and single, I'd met her, I'd liked her, I'd thought I'm going to summon up my courage and invite her on a date. And I did a bit of research, as you do, and I checked with a very dear and loyal friend of mine and said, does she have a boyfriend? And he said, no. So I said, great. Made the phone call. You know what it's like, guys. It's that kind of heart in your mouth kind of moment. And I asked her if she'd like to come out with me. I said I'd enjoyed her company. And she said, "Ah." I said, well, that's nice. I wish you all the best with the wedding. I'm sorry, I didn't know. And I went back to my friend and I said, you skunk. What's this about? She hasn't got a boyfriend. He said, well, she hasn't. She's got a fiance. And seeing her in the foyer, the embarrassment came back. Fortunately, she was very gracious and nice about it, and we had a bit of a laugh together about history. And I just wanted to tell you that because I don't know how you felt walking into a church this morning. I know for a lot of people that's a pretty freaky experience. I know if you've come with a churchy friend, you might be. I don't know what that's like. I just wanted to say, don't be embarrassed. We're all here because we think that there's a kind and forgiving God who understands our blunders, some of which are our fault, some of which are other people's, and who welcomes us and who likes us and who puts up with our foolishness and kindly teaches us on the outside through his book, on the inside through his spirit. And that's why we're here, not because we're saints or geniuses or anything like that, simply because we're curious and because we feel loved, knowing about that God. Having said that, a lot of people really struggle with the Old Testament God, as they call him. And a lot of the new atheists do a whole big critique of the so-called Old Testament God, about how vengeful he is. You read maybe the advertising for this. Richard Dawkins does this beautiful paragraph, beautifully written missile of words against the Old Testament God, how racist he is, how sexist he is, how horribly vindictive and violent and jealous and petty and nasty that God is. And it's not just the atheists. Oftentimes Christians, I find, really struggle to get their head around some of the stories in the Old Testament, and so do I. I teach Old Testament, that's my academic field, and I struggle, let me assure you, to get my head around some of those stories and how they fit with the idea of a loving and gracious and just God. But what I would like to do this morning is just look at a couple of those stories, one in particular, and just say, can we make any sense of that? And to be honest with you, I've chosen one of the two toughest stories that I know about in the Old Testament. Maybe another time we'll look at the other one. But this is probably the toughest and most grisly and ghastly story in the Bible. One feminist scholar called it a text of terror. I think she's spot on right. It's a text of terror. I will try to use big words so that my 4-year-old and your kids don't tune in. But before we go there, I want to tell another story just briefly. There was a young Indian intellectual who had grown up in a certain caste in India which were treated like dirt. He felt that ever since time and history was written, his people, his tribe had been trodden down. If they had a bit of land that somebody else wanted, they just grabbed it and took it away. If they wanted to enslave his people, they just did it at will. If they wanted to throw them in prison for crimes others had done, they did. And he felt absolutely harshly treated by his caste. And he just hated that. And it motivated in him, he was a smart kid, he did really well in school, and it motivated in him a desire to succeed and be better than he was thought to be. And so he came the top of everything. He studied the hardest. He worked the longest hours. He won the Rhodes Scholarship, which really takes some doing in a country of 1 billion people, and headed off to Oxford to do his studies. He came back to India and was pretty soon at a top level within a university. And he thought, I'm never going to put up with discrimination and prejudice and injustice, and I'm going to fight against that kind of stuff. And he became a Marxist. He became a follower of Karl Marx and the whole communist thing, which basically said, look, religion is just a drug that the rich and the powerful give to the ordinary person to keep them groggy and kind of happy while they rip them off. That was his view. and he was this kind of pretty angry young man. Somebody said to him, have you ever read the Bible? And he said, don't be ridiculous. Why would I read that book of oppression that's been used to keep the poor poor and to keep the powerless powerless? Don't be ridiculous. And someone said, but hang on, you're an intellectual. You're meant to read widely. Come on, the Bible is an important book. Globally, it's been a real culture shaper. You better read it. So he said, oh, fine. And he picked up a Bible. He got himself a copy. And the first story that he got into was the story of Naboth. And some of you will know it. It goes like this. There was a guy just wandering around in his vineyard, enjoying the grapes, enjoying the fact that his grandfather had planted this vineyard here first. And this was his little chunk of promised land. And he loved it. He was just thinking, I'm going to hand this on to my kids. And this is so cool. This is the land that God promised us when we were slaves in Egypt, pulled us out of Egypt, gave us our own little piece of paradise. And here it is, mine is expressed in these grapes. And he was loving his morning. Then he heard a gruff voice behind him saying, oi! And he spun round, and it was the king, King Ahab. And he said, I want to buy your vineyard. I want to turn it into a vegetable garden. And Naboth went, inwardly, are you kidding me? You want to rip down these beautifully cultured grapes and plant vegetables? Okay, I like my vegetables, but come on. He said to him, Your Majesty, God forbid that I would sell the inheritance of my fathers. This has been in our family for generations. It really means something to us more than its price. It has an emotional value. And the king said, well, I'll pay you double. I'll give you a better one in its place. He said, Your Majesty, I'm sorry, but it's not for sale. So the king went home in a bit of a grump. And his wife came in and heard him grumping and humping around the house and said, what's up? And he said, Buffhead down there won't sell me his vineyard. And she said, well, are you the king of Israel or not? Is this how the king behaves? See, she was a Phoenician princess, and she had been raised in a very different religion. And I'm not picking on other religions today when I say this, but her religion was very different from that of the Bible. For her, the gods were a great big soap opera. There were a whole lot of gods up there, and the gods were not into justice or fairness or graciousness to the human race. In fact, if they got sick of the human race, they would just send a flood down. Shut up with all your noise down there. I said be quiet. Whoosh. And that's why they sent the flood. They had all these stories of violent, vengeful, nasty gods. And the idea was if you have power, use it to get what you want. And that's how she'd been brought up. And she'd married an Israelite who supposedly believed in a God of justice and covenant and grace. And she wondered why he was acting so weird, because her daddy would have known what to do. And she said, leave it to me, you weakling. And so he said, okay. And she wrote a couple of letters and pulled a few strings. And what happens? Pretty soon, Naboth is falsely accused in his hometown by a couple of scoundrels who get up for money and accuse him of things. And next second, he's dragged outside the city gate and stoned there by people. The accusers would have been the first to do it. In their law, if I accused you of something, I would have to find another witness to back me up. And then if you were found guilty, I'd have to drag you out the front and actually, get this, throw this first stone myself, right in your face. I'd have to walk up close and personal and go bang. And that would, I think, put a bit of a test on me, because I'd see your face in my dreams. And if I knew that I'd been unjust, I think that was meant to bug me and to stop me from thinking about doing that. But anyway, the witnesses did that, and Naboth, the vineyard owner, was killed, and so was his son, just in case he thought he could claim his father's property. And the king was like, great. And he went down and took possession of his vineyard. And he was walking around and they're going, great, I'm going to plant carrots here. And just then a prophet appears. Says, you think you can act like that? You think God doesn't care about that? Guess what? Because you and Jezebel have acted in this way, dogs will lick up your blood. This is a great kid story, isn't it? Just like something out of the Grimm brothers. Dogs will lick up your blood. And the king, how can you say, how dare you, how dare you? And the prophet was gone. And it comes true. If you read on through the biblical story, you see the king in his chariot out fighting in a battle, and somebody takes a lucky shot. It's a guy called Naaman, according to Jewish tradition. That's another great story. Takes a lucky shot with a bow and drops an arrow right down the crack between his chest plate and his helmet. Clunk. Internal damage, and he bleeds out all day watching the battle. He just fades and exsanguinates and just kind of bleeds out, covers his chariot floor with blood, and just dies there. What happens then? The chariot is taken back to the city and washed out. by the pool, the Bible grimly says, the pool where the prostitutes bathe. It's washed out there, and a passing dog goes, blood. And the king finds that his corpuscles become the food for a pack of hungry dogs. And then the story goes on. Jezebel tries to seize power and does all sorts of violence to do whatever. And another king comes into the city where she's hiding, busts in through the gate. He's not exactly a charmer himself, but he's desperate to bring down that unjust regime. And Jezebel paints herself and does herself up beautifully using the main weapon that she's got left, and looks out the window at him and says, "Oh, you're here, you king killer." And he doesn't even bother to argue. He just shouts up to the servants in the window and says, "Who's on my side? Who? And they don't even dare to say it because they know that she can be such a killer queen. And so they just say, and he says, "Then push her out the window." And so they do. There's even a word for that. It's called defenestration. Okay? So they go and that's your word for the day. So they defenestrate Jezebel. Boom. She hits her. This is violent stuff. She hits the ground. The chariot runs over her, and then the new king goes in and has lunch. It's a gory culture. And then, after lunch, he goes, "Oh yeah, she was a prince's daughter. We probably should give her a decent burial." And they go out and try to find her. What's happened? Again, a passing pack of dogs have gone, meat. And they've gone and the only part of her that is left is soles of her feet, the palms of her hands, and her skull. You might have thought her heart was pretty tough as well, but they managed to chew that. And you have this horrific story, and you get to the end of that story and you go, is that the God I'm meant to love? Was he involved in that? That kind of gory stuff? This Indian guy is reading this story and he goes, he says, "That's brilliant. That is unbelievable. To think that God cares about the land rights of the ordinary person. To think that God cares about justice for somebody who can't afford the best lawyer." And he's blown away. And he actually said, upon reading that story, he said, if there is that kind of God, that would be a good thing. To cut a long story short, and it wasn't this simple as this story may sound, but over a long process of time, he became convinced that in fact there was a God who does care about the rights of the poor and the downtrodden, like his people. And he became a Christian. He became a believer in a God of fierce justice and also grace, because to him, to an oppressed person, maybe not to me in my comfortable Sydney lounge room, but to an oppressed person, that sounds like fantastic news. Is it a bit violent? Yes, it is. But if you see what it's trying to do, it's trying to say God cares about the poor, so don't mess with them. And even gentle Jesus makes some comments like that, doesn't he? He says, anyone who causes a kid to stumble, anyone who abuses, who messes with, who discourages a child, what? Better what? Better that they tie a big rock, big millstone around their neck and jump off the back of a fishing boat. That's pretty tough talk, because he's trying to underline the fact that God cares about the little ones and the poor and the vulnerable. And if that's true, I think that's great news. I could actually like a God who steps in a tough way and defends the cause of the underdog. I could love that God. I'm probably not much of an underdog, but I guess as Aussies too, we have a sense of a fair go for everybody. We have this ideal that this is going to be a classless country. This is going to be a place where everybody gets a fair go. And I think that kind of matches nicely with the kingdom of God. The violence, what do you do with that? Well, we're dealing with a very violent culture. We're dealing with a very violent culture. And it seems to me, you often hear people complain about the violence in the Old Testament. I had a dinner recently. I met a new guy and we were having a bit of a chat, and he said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I teach theology." And he goes, "Oh, geology. All right, yeah, that's cool." I said, "No, theology." He's like, and he had to think for a second, and he went, "Oh, study of God. Oh, right." And suddenly I was a bit of a weirdo. I'd been okay a minute earlier, but apparently I got weird at that point. And he said, "So, could you believe in a God who ordered the mass destruction of the Canaanites? Could that ever be moral?" And I said, "Well, look, do you just want a cheap 15-second soundbite, or did you actually want to ask an intelligent question and have an intelligent discussion about a really complicated topic?" And he kind of went, oh. I said, "Well, let me ask you a question. The bombing of Hiroshima in 1945, could that ever be morally justified? Hundreds of thousands of people losing their lives, becoming damaged by radiation. Could that ever be morally justified? And he sat back and he kind of, to his credit, he said, that's a really complex question. And I said, yes, it is. And so's the one that you've asked me. Because when you think about it, I'm not here to tell you Hiroshima was a great idea. I'm not here to defend it. I'm simply here to point out the fact that it was a complex decision. If you talk to Churchill at that time, you read his writings on it, he thinks that any attempt to invade the Japanese mainland would have cost about 1 million British lives, about 1 million American lives, and probably something like 2 million Japanese lives. And so they decided at the time, and I know they're playing God, probably badly, but they decided at the time to take out a few 100,000 to give a serious, we're serious kind of message, and hopefully end the war early. And their aim was to save lives, believe it or not. Now I know, I'm not saying it was a lovely thing and it was a great day for the human race when the Enola Gay dropped that damaging bomb on that city, or a little while later on Nagasaki. I'm not defending it, but what I'm saying is, in context, that kind of extremely ridiculous violence is in some ways understandable. That's just a very simple answer to the whole problem of violence in the Old Testament. It's almost like, let me put it to you another way. If you were in the Battle of the Bulge, after D-Day, when the Allies had landed and were moving towards trying to liberate the people in Hitler's fortress Europe, the Battle of the Bulge happened where the German forces pushed back. And some of the major players in that campaign were the Hitler Youth. They were young kids, because by this time Germany, God forbid, had lost so many good young men that they were sending in teenage boys and pre-teens and primary school kids in the Battle of the Bulge. Read the history of that. And it's a tragic thing. But my question is, if you were one of the liberating forces, if you were in a regiment on that day, and a 12-year-old came at you armed to the teeth, brainwashed with hardcore propaganda that you were evil, right ready to kill you, what would you do? What would you do? Would you just say, Jesus loves you, and wave a flower at them? I'm not sure that you'd survive, or that your army would survive if that was the tactic you occupied. Now, I'm not here to try and defend war or say that it's a good thing, but I think there is a tradition within Christianity, as with other religions, of a just war. A just war. Not a war for oil, right? Not a war for turf, but a war for ideology. A war for liberating people from a disgusting ideology. And when I look at the Canaanite situation in the Old Testament, without going into the details, because that's the other tough chapter that I might talk to you about another day, I think there's some evidence to say if you try to understand it in its historical context, it becomes a lot less simple than just, oh, that was really violence, violence is bad, the end. It becomes a lot more complicated than that. But that's not the story I want to look at today. Today, let's have a look at the book of Judges, and I want to read you this horror story. And it starts by saying, in those days, Israel had no king. Judges chapter 19. Judges chapter 19. If you've got a Bible, feel free to follow along. In those days, Israel had no king. No, a Levite. Fell off, did it? Thank you. I'll stick it on there. Stick it in my ear, you're telling me, aren't you? Thank you. Okay, there you go. A Band-Aid. It probably looked like Norman Gunston, but that's okay. All right. Thank you, that'll work. Good. Now, a Levite, that's someone who comes from a family of temple workers, right? So you could say a clergy kid. Now, a clergy kid who lived in a remote area of the hill country of Ephraim took a concubine, that's a common law wife, from Bethlehem in Judah, a de facto relationship, but she was unfaithful to him. And she left him and went back to her father's house in Bethlehem, Judah. This is Judges chapter 19, if you're still turning. So here you've got this guy from a temple background, forms a de facto relationship, which his religion actually says he should do a bit better for her than that. He should actually make a covenant with her, because his God is a covenant-keeping kind of God, right? A God of faithfulness. But anyway, he does that, and she leaves him. Maybe some of you are feeling exactly the same at this point, I don't know. She leaves him and goes back to her dad. And then after a while, he misses her, and he decides to go and speak to her heart, the Hebrew says. And so he goes to see her after 4 months. And he takes his servant, 2 donkeys, and she welcomes him into her dad's house. She says, come in, it's great to see you. And you think this is going to be a nice love story that resolves, right? They've had some difficulties, and then they work it all out, and it's going to be this lovely romantic story, and they're going to go back home together and start a new life. Great. And they do. Except the dad keeps them there for quite a while, and the dad's so happy, the girl's dad. Stay, eat more, eat more. And he's so hospitable, he's lovely to them. Oh, please, stay another day. The fridge is full. There's plenty to eat and drink. Stick around. Okay, we will. Stay again another day. Okay, we will. Please, one more day. And eventually they drag themselves out of his hospitality. We have to go. And so they leave, but they actually leave a bit late in the day. And so they're traveling towards dark. And they get to part way along their journey, and they're obviously not going to make it home in time. And so the decision comes, well, what do we do for accommodation? And the servant says, maybe we could stay in one of the Canaanite cities. And the master goes, we're not staying with those Canaanites. The Canaanites are the pits. We're not staying in a Canaanite city. I'll tell you in a minute a bit more about Canaanite culture, and you might agree with him. We're just not going to stay with those Canaanites. And so we'll go to one of our cities. We'll go to Gibeah in Benjamin, right? One of our cities. Can I put it, this is going to be silly, but let me put it to you in Christian terms or in Adventist terms for Sydney, right? We're not going to go and stay in Bankstown with all those mosques everywhere, right? No. We're going to go and stay in the Bible Belt near Hillsong, right? Or, in Adventist terms, we're going to go and stay in Wahroonga, right? Because at least we know they're what the people are like, right? They're us. They're the good people, okay? They're not these horrible cigar-smoking, tea towel head, and all the racism kicks in, right? We're not going to stay with the Canaanites. Okay, all right. And so they go and they stay in this town of Gibeah. Great. Except that there's a total breakdown in hospitality. You're meant to invite a traveller home to stay in your back shed or your spare room, but nobody does. There are no formal hotels probably. So it's up to the saints to give some hospitality to these people, and guess what? It doesn't work. And so they're sitting out there, tum-tee-dee, in the town square. Someone's meant to invite us home about now. Nobody has. What's going on? And this old man comes up. He's not from there. He's from near where they come from, actually. Or where the man comes from, and he says, listen, come and stay the night with us. And they say, no, it's okay, we'll just spend the night in the town square. No, you really do not want to spend the night in this town square. Oh, it's fine. No, come to my house. Okay, so eventually they go to his house. And they wash their feet and they have some dinner and they're just relaxing, getting ready for bed for the night, and that's all lovely and good, except then it all starts to go to custard, because what happens is, some of the guys from the city, in fact, all the men of the city, come. Let me read it to you. Verse 22. While they were enjoying themselves, some of the wicked men of the city surrounded the house, pounding on the door, or literally throwing themselves at the door, shoulder charging the door. They shouted to the old man who owned the house, bring out the man who came to your house so that we may, you can read what yours says. I'm just going to give you the Hebrew. It says, so that we may know him. Now, they didn't mean let's have a nice social time and know him. This is the Bible. You know what know means? Adam knew his wife, and she conceived and had a son. So you can know what's going on here. Okay? Bring out the man that came to your house so that we may know him. And he goes out there, and suddenly, this is a familiar story. Have you heard this one before? Have you heard this in a slightly different form before? You have, in Genesis, in the city of Sodom. So this writer is purposely copying. It's a homage. He's nodding to the Sodom story and he's going, I want you to see here that guess what? We, Israel, acts like Sodom, except, as you'll see, even worse. So he's purposely making it sound exactly like Sodom. And it could well be that this guy has heard the Sodom story when he was in Sabbath school as a kid, and he's gone, I know what you do when a mob of men comes to your door wanting to know you. You go out, and here's exactly what Lot does in Sodom. He says, know my friends. That's a polite thing to say, isn't it? Know my friends. Not know you evil, but know my friends. Don't be so vile. Actually, it doesn't say that. That's a mistranslation. It says, don't do this vile thing. Don't do this vile. See the difference? He's not saying, you're vile. He's saying, you're my friend. Please don't do this vile thing. It's good psychology. Right? It's good parenting, I guess, too. You're a good kid who's done a bad thing. You're not a bad kid. Right? And so he says that to them. He's very polite, exactly like Lot did to the men in Sodom. Since this man is my guest, please don't do this disgraceful thing. Look, here is my virgin daughter and his concubine. I will bring them out to you now, and you can use them and do to them whatever you wish. Woe. But to this man, don't do such a disgraceful thing. Oh my word. The first thing I need to say here is, not everything in the Bible is put there as our positive example. Is it fair to say? And this is the mistake Richard Dawkins makes in reading the scriptures. You read his book, this highly erudite man, a member of the Royal Society of Literature, okay, who really knows how to read a document, I would have thought, looks at the Bible and says there's two ways to read the Bible. Number one, you can read it for its commandments and laws, or you can read it and follow its example. Come on. Way too simple. If you did the same with Shakespeare, you would think that Shakespeare was in favour of people killing Scottish kings, right? What he's trying to say to you is go and kill a Scottish king. No, he's not. Sometimes, let me state the obvious, although any kid could have said this, sometimes the Bible depicts horrible things and shows us their consequences. Does the Sydney Morning Herald approve of everything that it reports? No way. Sometimes it reports horrific stories, and it doesn't need to say, this is really bad, don't try this at home. It's just reporting it. And I think that's what the Bible's doing here. It's showing a hideous outrage about to be perpetrated on a woman. But let me moderate that slightly and say, I think the guy believes that he's being clever. Some will read this and go, see, women didn't matter in the ancient world. Women were nothing, men were everything, and so he's prepared to sacrifice his daughter and this guy's de facto wife rather than a man. I don't think that's what's going on at all. I think he's just copying what he saw in the Sodom story. What happened in the Sodom story? Well, Lot and his two angelic visitors, the same thing happens. The men pound on the door, bring out the men who came to you so we may know them. And Lot says exactly the same speech. And then he says the same thing. Here are my two daughters. You can take them and do to them whatever you want. What did the mob of men in Sodom say? No way, no thanks. Not interested in feminine flesh. We just want the blokes. And so Lot's been really clever. Don't forget, he's a really good negotiator. He's a very clever, savvy player. And he's going, fine, guys, have my daughters. Knowing that this mob does not have women on their mind. Except perhaps for swapping recipe tips. They have absolutely no interest in women at this point. And that's what he thinks. I'm serious, that's what he thinks. And so it's a polite gesture. It's like if you invited me to your home and offered me a ham sandwich. Okay? I'm a vegetarian. I'm going to say, thank you very much for your offer of hospitality. Your ham sandwich is very safe. And I'm not comparing a woman to a ham sandwich, I'm not at all, except to say that it's very safe to offer your virgin daughter to a mob of men who have other things on their mind. And it looks like a really diplomatic and strategic move. I think it's a dumb move and it doesn't work in this city, but that's the point. It works in Sodom, but it doesn't work in Gibeah. Why? Well, the writer's telling you, these guys are worse than the Sodomites. What? Well, Ezekiel says similar things. Jesus even says similar things. He looks at religious people of his religion in his time, and he says to them, woe to you, Chorazin, woe to you, Bethsaida, if the mighty works that I've done in you, your city, had been done in Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. In other words, he's saying, you guys are turning your back on the truth and love even worse than the people in Sodom did. Even worse than the people in Sodom did. And please, I just want to be really clear. This is not an attack. I know what Sodom means today. We think of it as one particular activity. I'm not trying to have a crack at one particular community and suggest their sin is any worse than my own. I just wanted to make that really clear, that this is not a cheap shot at that. In fact, what the text is saying is that a person who knows the truth and has spiritual training and turns their back on love and truth can act even worse than a person who never had it. Never had it. That's a big claim. And so this Bible story can't leave me sitting here smug going, I'm better than the people of Sodom. It can only leave me sitting here going, God, I hope I listen. I hope I listen to grace and truth. Otherwise, I'll be worse. It's also, and he says, do to them whatever you wish, but to this man, don't do such a disgraceful thing. But the men would not listen. See, they're worse than Sodom. And so the man took his concubine and sent her outside to them. And here comes one of the saddest verses in the Bible. They raped her, they abused her through the night, and at dawn they let her go. I can't tell you what a tragedy that is. And it's not like the writer goes, oh yeah, whatever, it was just another woman, that's what they want or deserve or anything. Nothing like that. Look at the outrage that happens. Every man in the kingdom goes, rah, that's terrible. They don't go, so what, that's all women are good for or something. They go, ah, massive national outrage, quick, everybody get together, let's have this massive conference about it, rah. So please don't think the writer's just treating this lightly or saying it's another ordinary day in Israel. This is a massive generational scandal that erupts when this poor woman is so hideously mistreated. When God's daughter is treated like that, don't you think God's going to be up in arms? Don't you think anyone who loves her or anyone who loves their mum, their sister, themselves is gonna rah? And that's what happens in this text of terror. And it gets even worse before it gets better. But at daybreak, the woman went back to the house where her master was staying. Or husband, master. She fell down at the door and lay there until daylight. And that's the tragedy. If that doesn't break your heart, read it again, because, she goes as close as she can to go and get help. And she's reaching out for help from the man who supposedly loves her and cares about her. But she lies there in the early morning when all the cowardly scum have had their fun and then run home. She still lies there going, can someone help me? When her husband got up in the morning and opened the door of the house and stepped out to continue on his way, what? What, you've just written her off and you're going to move on? Is that your love and commitment to this woman? This guy's a bozo. I want to punch him right now in the story. I read this as I go, is that how you treat her? Okay, maybe you don't rush out there and try to defend her. Maybe you do the maths and realize there's 100 men out there, you haven't got a chance. But at least you should go out and have a go. Or if not that, then at least do something. At least monitor how she's going through the night. At least when you do get an opportunity to help, go out there and help, you cowardly so-and-so. But he doesn't do any of that. And you go, this is a clergy kid in Israel? How low has that culture fallen? That the care is just not there. And he gets up in the morning and steps out. There lays his concubine, fallen on the doorway of the house. And look what the writer says, with her hands on the threshold. Ay, ay, ay. Here's this beautiful feminine hand and fingers reaching out to the door for help. And the writer shows you that, depicts the beauty of that hand, reaching out for help, help that never comes. And you just go, oh, it's breaking my heart. It's tragedy, that little touch. He said to her, get up, let's go. That's really sensitive. But there was no answer. Then the man put her on his donkey and set out for home. So we don't know if she's alive or dead at this point. We assume she's dead, and if you think of some of the things that happen to people in war and how they can die of mass rape, that's a tragedy right there. But we don't know. Maybe he picks her up and thinks, oh, maybe she's alive, maybe I can save her, I don't know. He's in fear of his own life. He's a bit of a coward and a buffhead, but at least he puts her on the back of his donkey and tries to take her home. And here comes the even worse bit. If you've kind of followed me so far, this is really going to test you. Because what he does next, we've got to understand within the culture. Otherwise, he looks like Hannibal Lecter. He looks like some kind of butcher, some kind of psychopath. But he's actually not. At this point, when he reached home, he took a knife and cut up his concubine limb by limb. Is this the toughest story in the Old Testament? It's got to be pretty close. Cut up his concubine limb by limb into 12 parts and sent them into all the areas of Israel. What on earth is going on? Don't forget, we come from a culture, British culture, you put your dead loved one in a box. You don't see them again. You don't display them at the funeral. You grieve them privately, but you don't show off the body. This is a part of the world where you do. You put the battered body of your relative up on display, and you show what happened to them. And you see it on the news now if you go over to that part of the world. The other side has blown up the person I loved. Look at the mess they're in. Put them up on a piece of board and parade them through the streets. Show the rest of the world and the world's media, not that it's really ever reported in these countries, what happened to my loved one. That's what he's trying to do. Is it disgusting? Yes. But in the culture, he's trying to send a part of his loved one to all the different 12 state capitals of Israel and say, look what happened to the person that I love. It's his attempt to get some publicity and some awareness of people for what has happened to his concubine. And everyone who saw it said, such a thing has never been seen or done, not since the day the Israelites came up out of Egypt. Think about it. Consider it. Tell us what to do. In other words, and if you read into the next chapter, all the Israelites from Dan to Beersheba and from the land of Gilead came out as one man and assembled before the Lord in Mizpah, the leaders of all the people. I think it says about 6 times, all the men of Israel turned up for this. And they call it an awful crime. They say it's a hideous thing that happens. And they all make a massive outrage about it. They don't, it's important to say, they don't just say, whatever, another woman got whatever women deserve. No. They're horrified. And they get together and they try to take justice. Now I need to tell you just a little bit about Israelite religion at this point. They've been brought up on a religion that teaches them about a God of graciousness and justice. But in actual fact, right now, they're not following it. They're following Canaanite religion. And without wanting to, well, it's not like I could be any more gross than that story itself. Let me just tell you a little bit about Canaanite religion. Here's the deal. If you're a Canaanite, your aim in life is to be wealthy. Makes sense? So, how do you get wealthy when you're a farmer? Well, it's called fertility, really. You need your crops and your farm animals and hopefully your wife to be very, very fertile. Why? Well, so that you've got plenty of fruit and vegetables, plenty of goats and sheep and cows to sell and to milk and to use and all that to eat, and plenty of big, strong sons and daughters to work your fields. If you get all that, you'll be rich. Okay, where does fertility come from if you're a Canaanite? Fertility comes from the gods. And without being gross, I kind of have to be a little bit gross. If you read the ancient texts of the Canaanite religion, it comes when the gods get up to a bit of hanky-panky up there. Okay, when the gods get a bit funky with one another, that's when the earth becomes fertile. Particularly, there's a whole bunch of old documents that say that if you can get Baal, the storm god, Baal, excited, like really excited, then it'll rain. In other words, when Baal ejaculates, it rains. That's what Canaanite religion says. Lovely days and good weather. Makes you want to kind of carry an umbrella everywhere you go. When you think of that's the religion that's being taught to these guys. And so how do we get the gods to get active up there with their hanky-panky? Well, we remind them of it. How do we do that? Well, we reenact it in the temple. So you come along to church and you watch a XXX rated show. Or maybe afterwards you go and attend a little booth out the back where somebody is waiting to satisfy your XXX kind of fantasies, and you pay your money for that, and then you go home. That's their religion. I'm not making this up. It's well attested in the historical literature. That's what the Canaanites were into. It's called a fertility religion. When you think about it, it's a pretty gross, pretty degrading view of God. Like God needs to watch human porn. Ugh. And it's also pretty degrading. When you look at the effects of what that religion did to Israel, it's disgusting. The prophet Amos paints perhaps the most graphic picture of it when he talks about a father and a son going off to one of these fertility shrines together, and he says they use the same girl. Imagine that. The dad and the boy go in together. This is maybe the kid's first time. Okay, Dad, let's go off to church together, and who goes first, and how do they talk about it afterwards, and what does the boy think about his father and his mother? And what does he say to his dad? What, mum's not enough? You have to, do this? Oh, is that how it is with women? Okay then. What does it do to his view of women? What does it do to his view of the volunteer who's been acting out? It's a disgusting thing. What also does it do to sexual health? What does it do to the physical health? What diseases are roaring around those communities being handed on at church? And what does that tell you about God? God's not a covenant keeper. God's not a God of steady, wise love. God's just a God of do whatever you like. And it's a radically different religion from the one Israel's been brought up with. I don't want to belabor this point, but it's important context for understanding this story. That's what's been happening to Israel over the last few generations. They've had Canaanite religion knocking on their door. And it's on every second page of the Old Testament. You turn the page and there's Canaanite religion again. There's fertility religion. Why? Because it's ridiculously attractive. If we said this morning there was going to be a XXX show at church, we'd have cars queued all the way. It still has that massive appeal for people. But God's going, no, I'm a God of faithfulness. One God, one husband and wife, love, covenant, commitment, faithfulness. That's the best way to live. And this other religion's going, many gods. Love whoever you're with for the next 2 minutes. You know, it's just a radically different approach to life. And that's been chewing away at Israel. When you read through the book of Judges, this is what's happening, and you can see it. You can measure it in the way that that culture is falling. That culture is getting worse and worse and worse. How do we know? One of the measures is the way women are treated. If you look at the beginning of the book of Judges, you've got these awesome women. You've got the prophet Deborah, and I wish we had time this morning to tell the story of her. She's this incredible, gifted woman. She's the top legal mind of her nation at the time. She's the national leader. She's also got this gift of prophecy whereby God literally speaks to her and she gives prophetic messages to the world. Who knew that a woman could be a prophet? Oh wait, we're in an Adventist church. Okay, you knew that. And so here's this whole thing. You know, you've got this incredible woman at the beginning of the book of Judges. Then you've got another one called Asa. She's an amazing girl. She's the daughter of old Caleb. You know, Caleb, who in his 80s goes in and, let me at the biggest giants, let me go. You know the story of Caleb. He has this stunning daughter called Asa. And the book of Judges briefly describes her family life. She marries this awesome young guy called Othniel, the force of God, this gutsy, brainy leader who becomes the national judge. And so what are we seeing? We're seeing women in whatever role they choose. We're seeing them in a role of national leadership or in a traditional household role, whatever you want. Women are honoured and respected. By the time you get to the end of the book of Judges, this is what you see. And the writer is going to you, do you see the trend there? Do you need me to spell it out for you? And the story gets even worse, actually, because the way they take justice is they go and try to wipe out the tribe of Benjamin that have done this horrible outrage to one of their women. And if you read the story on, they pretty much succeed in wiping out the tribe of Benjamin. What happens next? They go, oh, whoops, we can't wipe out Benjamin. We've got to build up the poor old tribe of Benjamin. We've got to have 12 tribes, otherwise we're all weaker. Ooh, how do we build up the tribe of Benjamin? We have to give them our daughters to marry them. Ooh, but we promised we'd never do that. How do we sort that out? Okay, well then we let them come and grab our girls from a cultural dancing ceremony that we're having, and all these forced marriages happen, and it's a mess. It's a hideous mess. And the writer is saying to you, look what happens when a nation throws over a religion that has to do with love and truth and instead falls into one that is about selfishness and lust. Look what happens. Does the writer like this story? Not very much. Does the writer want you to think, oh, that's normal, oh, that's good, that's who God is? Not at all. The writer's trying to say to you, if you have a notion that God is fair and kind and cares about the poor, maybe you'll live like that. But if you don't, if you think God is all about every man for himself and grab whatever you can and use power however you can, maybe you'll act like that. And if you act like that, look what it will do to the nation. And so you come to the end of the book of Judges and it's a mess. There's all these forced marriages and hideous treatment of women by their fathers in chapter 21. And the writer simply says, in those days Israel had no king. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. What the writer's trying to say to you is, that's a horror story. If everyone's just doing what they want, that's a horror story. And if you look at Judges again, in the early chapters, they might be doing evil in God's eyes. That's often repeated. They did evil in God's eyes, evil in God's eyes, evil in God's eyes. At least God's eyes were the moral reference point. At least God's eyes were the authority. But now, we've lost that. We've chucked God out the window, and we're just doing whatever we want. And you'll remember now in that story, at the chilling moment when the woman is put out the door to her fate, what does the man say? Do whatever you want. Can you see the irony? Treat her however you want. If I'm doing whatever I want, maybe I'm harming you and I don't give a curse about it. If I'm doing what I want, I'm not loving my neighbour. I'm not caring about the underdog. I'm not caring about a vulnerable woman, a stranger in my town. I'm just getting what I want. I'm just getting my jollies. Who cares how she suffers? Can you see the difference there? And interestingly, they're doing what's right in their own eyes. If you read the Judges, as the book of Judges, as the work of literature that it is, you see them doing wrong in God's eyes, wrong in God's eyes, wrong in God's eyes, wrong in God's eyes. Then you get the Samson story. And in the Samson story, it's all about eyes. He sees a woman. He sees a woman. He sees a woman. Eventually, what happens at the end of the Samson story? Has his eyes put out. And the writer's going, see? No, you don't. And then we get to the end of it. And we get to the end, and we're all doing what's right in our own eyes. Can I get a bit contemporary with this story now? I don't think that that's much different from what people are being told on university campuses today. Do what seems right to you. Morality is something you cook up, something you make, something that seems right to you. You don't need God in your morality. You don't need any sense of silly old religion telling you what to do. What a recipe for a sad life that would be. But here's my question, and I've asked it of some pretty heavy atheists. Why should I care? Why should I really care about somebody else? Where would I get my morality from, if not from God? Now please, by asking that, I'm not saying that I'm more moral than someone who doesn't believe in God. I'm not trying that cheap shot. That's rubbish. I know atheists who care about the poor. I've met atheists in Africa working for charities over there. I've met atheists working in inner city stuff for poor kids. I'm not trying to take a cheap shot and say atheists don't do the right thing, atheists don't care. But what I am saying is this: where would I get my sense of right and wrong if not from a God? If you talk to Richard Dawkins, if you talk to Sam Harris, these leading atheists, you say to them, why should I be moral? They'll say to you, because it helps your genes survive. Right? They'll say that the whole big thing in life is the selfish gene. And it's all about your selfish gene surviving and you know, you've studied this stuff in high school probably, right? You know that's the story. It's about, but the problem is, why should my selfish gene care about you? I'm just going to pick on you today. Why should my selfish gene care about you and your selfish gene? Stuff you. If you get in my way, poof. If you're not useful to me, you're irrelevant. And they try to say, well, there's kind of 4 reasons why a selfish gene might care about other people. Here they go. See how convincing you find it. The first level as to why a selfish gene should care about others is that I should care about you because maybe you can help me. Okay, there's some logic in that. If we're good neighbours, that's probably good. And you might help my kids. If I'm nice to you and your loved ones, maybe you'll be nice to me and my kids, and then my genes will survive in my kids even more successfully. Okay, that makes a bit of sense. But what about if you get old or poor or weak and you're never going to be any use to me? Well then, that doesn't help me care for you. Okay? So the second level then is that if I do that kind of thing, then maybe we'll live in a safe society. There'll be a society where it's safe for us all to be. Okay, that's good. And I think most people would probably have that sense of if I look after society, society looks after me. But if you're really smart, you know what you do? You look like you're a good citizen, and I look like I'm a good neighbour to you, but I'm actually stealing your stuff. And if I'm really smart, I can do that and look like a good neighbour, but actually be on the tittle, stealing your stuff, ripping you off in some way, and snickering to myself that I'm smarter than you are. Or there's perhaps some other reasons that they'll try to give as to why a person would be moral. And that can take you a certain distance. But ultimately, if it comes to a choice between my selfish gene and your selfish gene, I'm sorry, but you're going to lose every time. And that's the problem. Why shouldn't I? Why would I risk myself to look after someone who's genetically irrelevant? There's another reason, the third level, that Sam Harris and others will argue. They'll say, there's also a thing called advertising. If everybody sees me being charitable to you, then they're going to go, wow, he's a great guy, and my reputation will go up, and everyone will say, he's amazing. That'll advantage my kids, because they'll then say, well, they're the son of that amazing guy that gives to that poor loser. Sorry. And isn't that lovely? What a great family, and that advantages me. Okay, great. Except that Jesus already thought of that one, didn't he? And he said, when you do your charity, what? Don't make a big show about it. Just do it quietly and get your reward from God. It's like he's thought of all these levels of morality. And in a way, what about if the cameras are not on us? What about if no one's ever going to see it? How would I treat you then? That's the question. And so I think there's a pretty good case for saying that you can't ultimately get morality without a sense of a belief in God. And so I come to the end of all this and I go, I actually think we need that Old Testament God. I actually think we need that God that cares about the poor. I think you get to the end of the book of Judges and it says, in those days Israel had no king. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And if you've just survived that gut-wrenching horror story and you read that, you go, well then it looks like we need a king. It looks like we need someone to make an objective, beautiful law. A bunch of laws based on love and concern for everybody. We need somebody to turn up and be a good lawmaker, don't we? And you come to the end of that book and you're just about ready to pray what Jesus asks you to pray in the Lord's Prayer. Thy kingdom come. thy will be done. You get to the end of that Old Testament book and you're saying, could the Messiah please turn up now? Could he please hurry up and bring his kingdom and his beautiful love-based law, and could he please come now? And if you're saying that, you're pretty close to what Jesus is asking you to pray. You're looking for the kingdom of God. You're looking for a kingdom of fairness and goodness and justice. Does it arrive with a bit of violence? Yes, it does. Read about the second coming. It's the most violent day of human history. Okay? It's also the best day there is. But this kingdom arrives, yes, with a bit of violence to those who oppose it, but it's a kingdom of love and of grace and of beautiful laws and of an awesome, awesome king who cares for the underdog. 60 seconds, I want to tell you though, that's not the best news I know. Best news I know is not the fact that there is a God who establishes what is just and right and fair and cares about the underdog. That's not the best news I know. Because my problem is, I'm not naturally like that. I'm naturally selfish. And so even if there is this awesome, great God out there, where does that leave me? It probably leaves me on his wrong side, to be honest with you. Because I'm selfish. I've ripped people off. I've been unfair to people. I haven't acted with love always. And if you feel a bit the same as that, you're going to love the next bit. Romans chapter 8 says, what that perfect law could not do, in that it was weakened by human flesh, God did. He sent his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, in other words, quite a lot like me. And he sent him as a sacrifice for sin, so that what? So that the righteousness of the law could be fulfilled in us. In other words, there's this great news called the gospel that says God's got a perfect law, and imperfect people like me can be happy about that because God is gracious. God knows that we've mucked it up. God looks at our faulty, slobby, selfish, stupid moments and goes, I can forgive that. I can forgive that. I can give you a new heart. I can make you somebody who wants to be in my new kingdom of love and justice and grace. And that's the good news. The good news is that that king came. That king turned up. And he not only taught the most beautiful moral principles in the Sermon on the Mount, that would have helped me a bit, but when I couldn't keep them, he went to the cross and he took my guilt with him. And now I know I can join his kingdom. Not because I've got a beautiful track record, not because I can boast about my great virtues today, far from it, but because I can trust that that king is kind and forgiving and gracious. That's the good news. And that's just such a useful thing in life. I think we need that God. That is the Old Testament God. The Old Testament God sent his Son, his other self, to do that for us. Because like it says, the Lord is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in kindness. And that's the kind of God I'm going to suggest that every person needs. Let me pray with you. Father, in this gory, horrible story, in this dark moment of human history, we don't really see that much of you. We see that you are a God who allows humans to be free with all the pain that has come from that. But I guess you wouldn't have it any other way. You want us to be absolutely free, intelligent beings that can either love you or not, and can either choose to be like you or not. And it's funny that you would think that was worth going to the cross for, that you would personally pay for that, you would personally suffer just to preserve our ability to choose what we're going to be like. And yet you're standing there behind our history, our world's history, and our personal history going, this is the right way, this is what's right, this is what love would call you to do, this is what's fair, and you're asking us to do that. And you're not forcing your will on us, but you're just calling us. And in those sneaky moments, in those dark corners of our hearts sometimes, you're there going, you know what the right thing is. You know it would make you and others happy long term. I just want to thank you for being like that. Thank you for being such a source of good in a troubled world, such a source of light in a dark world. Thank you for having a law that is holy and just and good and based on love from first to last. But when we couldn't keep that law, when we were fallen and flaky, thank you for stepping in and going to the cross to pay for our sins. Thank you for putting your Holy Spirit into our hearts, whether we acknowledge you or not, to call us towards love and truth and all those good things. And I pray that we who are getting to know you and want to know you more would be influenced by who you are, by your gracious, covenant-keeping, forgiving nature, that we'd be a bit more like that. I just pray too that your kingdom would come. That one day the weak and the poor and the powerless would find equality and fairness in the kingdom of the Messiah. Pray that we would look forward to that and put our life energies into it. In Christ's name.